Entonces ahora sí, muy buenos días. Tengo el enorme gusto de inaugurar el segundo día del Encuentro en Género y Políticas Públicas, tejiendo puentes entre la formación y la práctica, con la Conferencia Magistral de Htun. Ella es profesora en Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad de New Mexico, ¿no? Y directora y co-principal investigadora de Advance, ¿no? Y asesora especial para la inclusión, ¿no? En la escuela estoy traduciendo, ¿no? Entiendo que es ingeniería, y tiene un extensísimo trabajo en el tema de los derechos de las mujeres, las inequidades sociales y las estrategias para promover la inclusión y la diversidad. Es autor de innumerables libros, pero entre los más recientes e importantes está The Logics of Gender Justice, State Action on Women's Rights Around the World, ¿no? Que fue en coautoría con Laurel Weldon y publicado por Cambridge University Press, y esta cuenta también con muchísimos artículos. ¿Qué más? O sea, hay muchísimo más para decir sobre Mala. Ha sido vicepresidente de APSA, ha servido en distintos comités y estamos muy, muy, muy honradas de que nos acompañe en esta conferencia, que creo que nos ofrecerá un marco imprescindible para el tema que nos ocupa hoy. Entonces, Mala, adelante. Antes voy a aclarar verbalmente, y ya lo hemos dicho, Mala va a exponer en inglés. Quienes quieran traducción pueden ir a la barra que está abajo de la pantalla, al simbolito de mundo que dice interpretación, y elegir la opción de español, y van a escuchar a Mala traducida al español, ¿sí? Entonces, por favor, cuentan libremente con esta posibilidad de escucharla directamente en español. Entonces, adelante, Mala.
Muy buenos días a todas. Quisiera agradecerle a Gisela y los liderazgos de FLACSO. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí y tener esta oportunidad. Pido disculpas que voy a seguir en inglés, y voy a exponer en inglés, y después, si me quieren hacer preguntas, el español está bien. Adelante. And I'm going to try to speak slowly to facilitate the translation. So today, I'm going to talk about a theoretical perspective that I've been developing over the course of several research projects about the multiple logics of women's rights. And I'll explain that theory. Then I'm going to show some data and talk about the distribution of women's rights globally on two issues: violence against women and family law. So women's legal capacity or legal agency in family law. And then in the last part of the talk, I'm going to ask the so what question. Are there measurable effects of progressive egalitarian women's rights legislation on social practices, behavior, and attitudes? So does it matter for social change that countries are adopting more equal laws? And I'm going to give two examples. And one is the global relationship between restrictions on women's legal capacity in family law and their economic agency. And then I'm going to present some recent research we did, actually using the NDIRE surveys in Mexico, of the effects of violence against women legislation on experiences of violence, domestic violence, reporting, and attitudes. So the origins of this approach I've been developing for a long time, starting in my first book on gender-related legal changes in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile during authoritarian and democratic rule. I explained and endorsed a disaggregated approach to women's rights, where we need to consider each issue separately. That change on one issue doesn't necessarily imply change on others. In my book, Inclusion Without Representation, I found that the adoption of gender quotas in Latin American countries delivers greater presence and power. So women are occupying a greater share of legislative seats, but that this doesn't imply the representation of women's interests, grassroots interests especially, or feminist policy change. That a lot more work needs to be done to link the mobilization and articulation of interests from the bottom with legislative changes at the top. So these works then raise questions about what actually explains state action. If it's not women's representation in leadership, what explains state action to advance women's rights and gender justice? Is it democratization, economic development, mobilization of feminist movements, international norms, or secularization, meaning a decline in the power of religious organizations and the hold of religious beliefs? We also noted that state action on women's rights varies not just across countries and over time across countries, but also within them. So as you'll see today, countries can be progressive on some issues, but not on others. So many Latin American countries were the first countries in the world to adopt gender quota laws. And you'll also see the first countries in the world to adopt comprehensive legislation to combat violence against women. But Mexico is now an exception, the last countries to liberalize abortion, meaning to permit elective abortion, at least in the first trimester. The United States has long had legal access to abortion, but we stand alone among advanced democracies for no national paid family leave and no national program for childcare. Sweden and Norway, opposite the United States, have expansive family and social policy, universal access to childcare starting at age 1, over a year of paid family leave and a daddy's quota, but they were slower than Latin America and the US to take action to combat violence against women. And so what we've found over these projects is that existing perspectives on gender in the state were not so good at explaining this intra-country variation. Okay, so these big approaches at the top, democratization, economic development, feminist movements, could explain progress or no progress, but not the variation across different women's rights issues. So we started developing a theory that involved unpacking gender, what gender is, into different dimensions, and then disaggregating policies that advanced gender justice or women's rights. Here, I'm really talking about women's rights. I'm not talking about heteronormativity and a whole other dimension of gender justice. I'm really talking about just women's rights. Disaggregating policies that advanced women's rights along each of those dimensions, and then specifying, laying out the ways that each policy invokes different histories, conflicts, and involves different actors. So just to review, and this is a lot of information, so I'm going to go more quickly, but we have written this down so you can look at it later. But the dimensions of gender following people like Iris Young, Nancy Fraser, Judith Butler, Evelyn Nakano-Glenn, they're different dimensions of gender. They're multiple sub-institutions of gender. And this is a whole theory of gender as an institution, not an identity. But there is a status hierarchy. So Nancy Fraser writes about institutionalized patterns of cultural value that elevate men and subordinate women. They also write about the division, the historical sexual or gender division of reproductive labor, the delegation to women of work involved in maintaining humans on a daily basis and across generations. And then normative heterosexuality, which Butler says is the naturalization of these equations, that having a woman's body means you have a feminine identity and you desire men. Having a man's body means that you identify and act as masculine and you desire women. So Butler says that those equations have been naturalized and normalized, when in fact, in reality, there are no equations. Everything's all mixed up, right? It's all mixed up. So these are the institutions of gender. So what does promoting equality mean? It means that the state and interested activists need to take action to combat these institutions. So challenge the patterns of the status hierarchy that make men normative and value men and women as subordinate, subhuman, other, non-universal. Challenge the gender division of reproductive labor by revaluing, redistributing, reducing the toll of reproductive labor. And then this is another dimension I'll explain, but we say expand the realm of deliberative and accountable politics over the regulation of kinship. So religious organizations historically governed kinship and reproduction. So all issues involving birth and pregnancy and marriage and the child, what the child belonged to whom and who had rights over that child, moving that realm of governance away from religious institutions and toward the state or toward a more open realm where visions of who controls reproduction could be more equitably debated and challenged. So we call that the doctrinal realm. So in our 2018 book, Laurel Weldon and I have a typology of policies to promote women's rights, where we disaggregate along this status and class dimension following Fraser. And then the top one that I have always felt was important, which is, does the issue challenge the doctrine of religious organizations? No or yes. And we see a big difference here. And I'm just going to stress the violence against women and family law issues, because violence against women is a non-doctrinal issue for the most part, meaning you don't have Roman Catholic bishops defending violence against women, defending domestic abuse, defending sexual violence, rape. But you do have Roman Catholic bishops, for example, saying that marriage is indissoluble, there shouldn't be divorce, that life begins at conception, abortion is murder. And so there's a very different political dynamic that plays out with doctrinal and non-doctrinal issues, especially in Latin America. You know, you have bishops going to the mat to fight against divorce and abortion. You know, when I was studying the legalization of divorce in Brazil in the 1970s, there were bishops leading giant marches of tens of thousands of people through the streets of Sao Paulo against divorce bills. So they were very, very aggressively challenging legal change on these doctrinal issues. But you don't see, except for some rare cases in certain parts of the world, you don't see religious mobilization against comprehensive violence against women laws, or against another issue we have here in this upper left quadrant, against legal equality in the workplace. So the removal of restrictions on women's work, such as in Latin America, you know, labor unions fought for clauses in labor laws to prevent women from working at night, to prevent pregnant women from working, to prevent women from working in certain types of jobs, distilling alcohol, heavy machinery. And CEDAW and principles of equal opportunity helped erode those, and you didn't see Roman Catholic bishops objecting to those movements toward legal equality in the workplace. So just looking at these, and then the class issue is another one. The class issue, and I have a paper that I just wrote about this, but the class issue is much less, does the issue bear more heavily on women overall, or is the issue broken down by class? And to put it rather crudely, can rich women buy their way out of the problem or not? And so we see with reproductive labor that if you have resources, women hire other women to perform the reproductive labor. And this burden is no longer a barrier for their other barriers, but for their professional success. Whereas poor women are ones who are more likely to benefit from government public provision of reproductive labor in the form of childcare leave and childcare. Okay, so this typology implies at least 4 logics for change on women's rights. And I'm just going to talk about 3 today because the last one is more of a status class combination. But so we have predictions of these different logics or forces and patterns driving reform on women's rights. And the first one is status politics. So this is politics to challenge this cultural subordination of women, which drives patterns of violence, right? So the most recent research on why violence against women happens, domestic violence, sexual violence, institutionalized violence, is that it's related to the subordination of women in culture, that if there is a more equal status and gender equal culture, and you see this cross-nationally in research, that where social norms subordinate women, it's more likely that women will experience gender and sexual violence. So the change in status politics turns on the mobilization of autonomous feminist movements who leverage international norms to demand change. And we see these patterns driving progressive change on violence against women and on equality in the workplace. But this is very different from the second logic of doctrinal politics, where change on divorce and abortion and family law, laws of personal status that are very strict in many Muslim majority countries, change depends on relations between the state and religious organizations. And so we have a whole theory about contexts where the state props up religious authority. For example, in the Brazilian Constitution for decades, the Constitution said marriage is indissoluble, right? In other contexts where the state appoints bishops, the state funds religious organizations, we say that this kind of close arrangement between the state and religion, which communism broke, is a major factor predicting the chances for change. And then finally, class politics, expansive social policy, paid parental leave, childcare. We say that this requires strong left labor parties. Okay, so now I'm gonna move to the next section, which is to look at how these laws and these 2 examples I'm focusing on, violence against women and discriminatory family law, how they're distributed globally. And this is work with Laurel Weldon and now my contemporary collaborator that I'm doing a lot of projects with now, Francesca Jensenius from the University of Oslo. And Francesca and I have used this World Bank Women, Business, and the Law data set, specifically the data sets from 2014 and 2016. And in 2016, there are 171 countries in the data set. So Laurel Weldon and I did 70, but this 171 countries is quite a large data set, although it's complicated to compare a country like Vanuatu or a very small country, even Belgium, with a country like China or Brazil or Mexico. It's not so comparing apples and oranges. And so here is a global map of countries that have And this is not all forms of violence against women. Violence against women includes stalking and violencia obstétrica, which I think you've invented there, rape, assault, and intimate partner violence. And this is just countries with legislation on domestic violence. And you can see that in the middle of sort of Central Africa, the darker color means that Russia has no legislation, but the vast majority of countries have adopted legislation and specific penalties to punish and identify, to typify and identify domestic violence. And they don't consider domestic violence just battery, and forgive the typo on the left, but the laws are recognizing physical, psychological, sexual, and then I think in Mexico, you also helped pioneer this concept of economic violence. So the laws that are on domestic violence, the majority are quite expansive in terms of recognizing different types of violence. Now, moving to the project with Laurel, we found that the main factors associated with expansive policies on violence were strong and autonomous feminist movements. And by that, we mean a feminist movement that's not just part of a political party. So like in China, you know, they're giant mobilization women's movements, but they're all controlled by the Communist Party. So autonomous from the party, autonomous from unions, autonomous from the state. Regional agreements, for example, the Convention of Belém do Pará from 1994, women's policy machineries, and then the interaction of these factors. So we found that these were associated with expansive policies on violence, and Laurel made this BAW index. So she has a 10-point index about how comprehensive the law is. And I just want to show you over time. So if you look at 1975, very few countries had done much to combat violence, meaning the numbers are very low on this index, okay? But by 1985, Canada, the United States, Venezuela, Australia start taking more, they have more comprehensive France legislation on violence. By 1995, Latin America has surged ahead of most of Europe, Asia, most of the world actually, except for the US and Canada, but Latin America has become a leader in comprehensive laws against violence. And by 2005, other parts of the world are catching up and Latin American laws have become even more comprehensive. Okay, so this is violence against women, right? And these are two different data sets. So now I just want to move to the second issue, which is gender discriminatory family law. And my point is that these patterns are different. Remember, I'm saying that gender issues are multiple and they differ from one another. They're governed by different logics. And that implies we're going to see different empirical patterns in how these laws and the discriminatory nature of these laws is distributed. And so the World Bank, again, has an index, has a data set that measures restrictions on women's legal capacity. And some of the most important ones here are, you know, can a married woman travel outside her home? Can she register a business? Can she choose where to live? Can she confer citizenship on her children? Does she have equal ownership rights to property? Can sons and daughters inherit equally from their parents? Does a woman's testimony in court? And then this good one on the bottom, right? Are married women required by law to obey their husbands? Which in Chile, by the way, changed in 1989. So up to 1989, the Chilean Civil Code said that women had to obey their husbands. All right. So this one is gender discriminatory family law. And we see that by 2016, the countries here are in red. So most countries have become, and Chile is still shaded, right? So here the red means, and the 11 means the number of, so the number of these restrictions, okay? So the red means that the country, like look at Saudi Arabia here, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan have lots of restrictions on women's legal agency. Chile still has more than, you know, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, right? Because Chile still doesn't have equal marital property rights. But we see that instead of, you know, we see that it's pretty clustered regionally. Also, Malaysia has a lot of restrictions. Malaysia, Nepal have a lot of restrictions on women's legal agency. But we see a very different pattern than what the violence against women pattern looks like. So 97 countries have no restrictions. 25 countries have one restriction, and the most common is women getting citizenship for their spouses. 20 countries have unequal inheritance laws. And then Iran, Sudan, Jordan, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia have just tons of restrictions, a huge number of restrictions on women's legal agency. And so the next point is that unlike violence against women, where I showed you those maps from 1975 to 1995, from 1995, where there was a lot of change over time, these family laws have remained fairly stable. And our argument is that it's not because countries are Muslim majority or they're poor, but it's countries where the state has established a very close and supportive and cozy relationship with religious authorities, whether they're Roman Catholic bishops or Muslim clerics, where we see these patterns. And we say that this close relationship between the state and religion matters because we see religion as a field of contestation where there are many potentially different interpretations of what the religion says. But when the state props up certain religious groups and certain religious actors, they tend to freeze the most patriarchal interpretations. So we've studied this dynamic in some Muslim majority countries, especially in Malaysia and in Egypt, where this having support from the state tends to give power to the most conservative and regressive actors with the most conservative views of what the religion says, and links those views to the public status of the religion more generally. So this cozy relationship with the state reduces religious pluralism, prevents feminist religious voices from having more influence, and freezes discriminatory family law. Okay, so just to summarize this section, women's rights issues follow different logics. In this analysis, I didn't look at violence against women, but family law doesn't always co-vary, even with equality in the workplace or paid family leave. And countries can be progressive on one dimension and not on others. There are exceptions. Australia, Norway, Portugal, and Slovakia we see as mostly progressive, and a cluster of countries in Arab countries, Malaysia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Saudi Arabia are mostly lagging. Okay. So now I'm going to move to the last section, and this will take me about 10 minutes. And I'm going to ask the question of, do these equal rights laws have any effect on social practices? And the two case studies are gender discriminatory family law and women's economic agency. And then we're going to present very briefly the results of our study of the expressive power of the 2007 extremely comprehensive Mexican gender violence law. So first section here, discriminatory family law and women's economic empowerment. So we did some quantitative analysis. Francesca, I should say, did most of the quantitative analysis, and found that these restrictions on women's legal capacity, women's inability to get a passport to work, the requirement that a woman obey her husband, are predicting these different 5 indicators of economic empowerment. The share of women with a bank account, the share of firms that have partial ownership by women, which we call a measure of women's asset ownership, women's labor force participation. We also look at the size of the informal sector, because the bigger the informal sector is, usually the fewer labor rights women have, and then the wage gap. And we don't see perfectly, but we see that restrictions on legal capacity are strongly associated with the share of women who have bank accounts, women's ownership of firms, and women's labor force participation. So we can look, just showing you some 2x2 plots here. On the bottom, we see what restrictions with women's legal capacity. Restrictions, these are the legal rights. And then here on the y-axis are the share of firms with women's ownership. And we see that moving from left to right across both panels, and the left panel is the raw data, the right panel is data with some controls in it. We see moving from left to right that as you have more restrictions on women's legal capacity, the number of firms, the share of firms with women owners is going down. And the same shows with female labor force participation, which is on the y-axis. The left panel is the raw data, the right panel are residualized data. And we see that as restrictions on women's legal capacity go up, the share of women participating in the labor force goes down. So there is a cross-national correlation showing that these restrictions on women's legal agency are actually a very big predictor of the actual economic agency that women have. And we also found that family law is a bigger predictor of women's economic empowerment than having equal labor law or having parental leave. Okay, so let me get to the next and last case study, and then I will wrap up very briefly. And this is a paper that is actually going to be published in World Politics Journal next year, hopefully in January. And this is a paper where we're looking at whether comprehensive legislation to combat violence against women is producing effects at a macro level in society, a macro level. And many countries, as you saw in the previous slides, have adopted expansive legislation. So legislation following second wave feminist arguments that combating violence requires a comprehensive approach. We need to name the problem as a violation of human rights. We need to provide services to victims. Perpetrators need to be punished. But primarily, we need to change the culture, a culture that normalizes violence, that silences victims, that makes it very risky for victims to speak, that makes it risky to be a survivor, to talk about your experience, and therefore inspire others. So countries in a phenomenal revolutionary trend have taken on these arguments and adopted comprehensive legislation. But it's another thing to make the case that these legislations are changing society at a mass level. So we'd like to show that they are, and use Mexico as the example. So the first question is, how do laws change society? Which we could talk about for many hours. But the historical view is that laws work by deterrence, that they impose punishments, and then people are afraid of being punished, so they obey the law. But there's another way that laws change society, which is by expressing norms. So norms are standards of what is appropriate and desirable behavior. And the idea is that laws change, they express new norms, and people want to comply with these norms, and so they obey the law. So this is a theory of expressive law. We follow Richard McAdams, but Cass Sunstein, Lawrence Lessig, Marianne Glendon, people have, there's a big group of people who talk about expressive law. So expressive law, but they rarely use empirical data, especially survey data, to test these theories. So the idea here is that law communicates information about norms. It tells a story, it sends a message, and people generally want to conform to norms. So Richard McAdams says that people conform to norms to gain status and esteem and avoid losing status or esteem. So the example I give is there's a totally non-legalized norm in my neighborhood about, picking up the number 2, the dog poop. You walk your dog, you have to pick up the dog poop. If you don't do it and neighbors see you not doing it, you are going to become, the bad person, have a bad reputation in the neighborhood, and people don't want that. And so people generally conform to norms to avoid losing esteem. So McAdams says that people, if the law expresses a norm, people want to conform to norms, this will induce compliance with the law. So bottom-up compliance. And Catherine McKinnon agrees. She writes that the real point of law is not incarceration or damage awards, but voluntary compliance, otherwise known as legal socialization or education. So we're making an argument that violence against women laws have expressive power, and that they communicate norms, and that people want to comply with these norms, and so they end up going along with the laws. And that's not to say, I've already mentioned, the laws have other effects. They punish offenders, they coordinate administrative responses, they provide social marketing, education campaigns, they protect victims, they create shelters, they do many things, but they also have an expressive power. So as most of you know, there's a long history of violence against women legislation in Mexico, driven by feminist activism and alliances between civic movements and elected officials. There's an evolution from the first generation of laws, starting in the 1970s. There were services in the 1980s, laws that recognized domestic abuse, marital rape, and sexual violence. And then a lot of activism and media coverage of major violations that led to a second momentum for a second generation. And so we're talking about the Ley General de Acceso de las Mujeres a una Vida Libre de Violencia, and the state laws as a global example of a comprehensive second generation law. And these laws, we're talking, when we're trying to measure the effects, we're measuring the effects of this bundle of legal change, feminist activism, and media coverage. So laws don't advertise themselves. People just, it doesn't have an automatic effect, but social actors who pushed for change then organize around the law to raise awareness, provide resources, and bring these laws to bear on society. So I don't have much time, so I'm going to go through this quickly. But it is a lot. We worked really hard for several years on this paper.
It's okay. It's okay. You have
okay,
time.
But so there's a long part where we try to operationalize what it means to see norm change. But let me see if, okay, so let me just go back to this. So what we mean to say norm change is that we follow McAdams and his 3 conditions. So a consensus in society of what good and bad behavior is, a greater risk that violations of the norm or bad behavior will be detected, and then more widespread knowledge that there is a detection risk and that there's a social consensus. And so we say that, what does this look like in society? Observable implications of norm change. Decline in rates of domestic abuse. And again, this is just of intimate partner violence, domestic abuse. This isn't about feminicidios. This isn't about violencia obstétrica. This isn't about abuse in the workplace. This is just intimate partner abuse. Decline in rates of domestic abuse, decline in attitudes that give way to domestic abuse, more women reporting to authorities. So we say that the more reports there are, this is a sign that things are better, because in a very entrenched violent society like Afghanistan, there's no reporting. No one talks about it because you'll be killed if you talk about it. So actually reporting means that there are more services and more believability, and women feel more comfortable coming forward. And then we look at knowledge of the law. So how do we look at these? We look at 4 waves of the amazing NMIRE survey from 2003, 2006, 2011, and 2016. And you can see in these numbers that especially by 2016, there are hundreds of thousands, over 100,000 women in this survey. And the survey, if any of you have looked at the questionnaire, is a gold mine of behavioral data, because it doesn't just ask, it asks about experiences of violence, but also about work, living conditions, and violence at work, violence in the school, violence in the hospital, discrimination. And we focus just on women in a relationship. So women in a relationship with a partner. And the survey is just of women. Okay, so is there a decline in rates of domestic abuse? So most people ask, did you ever experience violence in your lifetime? And this generates high numbers, 60%, right? But it doesn't tell us change over time. So some other scholars, Lori Heise, Andreas Kotzadam, have been looking at experiences in the previous 12 months. So did you experience any of these 28 forms of domestic abuse in the previous 12 months? And there are 28 forms because the survey follows the law in defining violence broadly, right? So we're looking, this is very important, at the previous 12 months, not at lifetime, and only women currently living with a partner. So you see that in 2003, 41% of women had experienced domestic abuse in the previous year. This goes down a couple percentage points in 2006, and then it starts going down very significantly in 2011 and 2016 to 33% and 27% of women who've experienced domestic abuse in the previous year. So this is a huge decline in a pretty short period of time, thinking that we're talking about, you know, previous year experience of violence, that this decline over this period is about 13 percentage points, is a very big decline. And you see this decline across all states. All states, which all the states are in the survey, and all the states are seeing this big decline at different rates than others, right? But all the states are seeing a big decline in the previous year. Attitudes are also changing. So the survey doesn't ask the same questions every year, but in 2011, it asked the most questions, and you see that very few say a man has the right to hit his wife. But quite a few more say a wife should obey her partner, a woman is obliged to have sex with her partner, and then violence is a family matter and should stay in the family, which we think shows that this is a privatization of violence. It's not a human rights violation, but it's a private matter. So this looks like a lot, but if you look at how much it's changed since 2003, between 2003 and 2011, in 2003, 10%, almost 10% said that a man has the right to hit his wife, which declined to 2% in 2011. And then 56% said a wife should obey her partner in 2003, which declined to 23%. So there's been major change in attitudes over time. And then we run what we call a placebo test. I just have to get my dog out of a placebo test, which means that, well, because people say, well, aren't attitudes on everything changing so much? And so the placebo test is, well, are they changing more on violence than on other issues? And the NDIRE asks about, should a man be in charge of all the costs in the family? And these numbers stay relatively stable. So we're arguing that attitudes on violence, about which there's direct legislation, are changing faster than attitudes on other gender issues. And then finally, we see more women reporting to authorities, reporting the intimate partner abuse to authorities, a rise from 6% down to 5%, and then to almost 8% in 2011, and then more women telling family and friends. So there's greater confidence, and we say that this is a greater detection risk. And then, so just to wrap up now, we're finding a decline in experiences of violence, decline in attitudes, a rise in reporting rate. And I didn't show this, but also knowledge of the law. These trends are consistent with norms condemning violence. And we see this as the result, not just of the law, but of activism, providing resources and building awareness of the law. And we imply that even weakly enforced, and we're in favor of enforcement, but even weakly enforced laws can have this norm changing effect. And if we see these changes in Mexico, which is arguably a hard case, then it's likely that similar changes have occurred elsewhere in countries with comprehensive legislation. And so just to summarize, I want to drive home the need to disaggregate, that coalitions and conditions of change vary, that we see variation across issues within countries and across countries. And finally, to drive home the point that people can get depressed when they see continued violations and abuses occurring and horrible episodes of crimes against women, and think that all the decades of activism have been for nothing. But we would like to think that our evidence shows that there has been change, that beyond the media headlines, that society at the grassroots level is changing to become less tolerant of violence and more accepting of the idea of women's rights, and that especially when feminist movements provide resources for people to claim their rights and hold state officials accountable, that the conditions for change will continue to evolve and improve. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to stop the share.
Thank you, Mala, for your presentation. Gracias por tu presentación. Hay algunas preguntas ya que van apareciendo en el chat.
Doctora, entonces, perdón que las interrumpa. ¿Puedo pasar a Valeria a canal normal para que pueda ella tal vez ayudar a traducir las preguntas que te plantean, o tú se las haces a
Mala, you need translation for the... No.
Okay.
No se las puedo preguntar en español. Ok. Si no entiendes algo, me comentas y lo trato de decir en inglés. La primera pregunta dice, bueno, gracias por esta excelente conferencia. mi pregunta para Mala es, dentro del poder de las leyes también está su carga simbólica. Existen leyes que los políticos usan como mecanismo para reforzar su legitimidad o para promover su reelección. En Centroamérica se están promoviendo decenas de leyes y políticas públicas para defender la vida y la familia, aun cuando la legislación vigente ya prohíbe el aborto y el matrimonio igualitario. ¿Cómo diferenciar la pregunta es, ¿cómo diferenciar las leyes con efectos en procesos judiciales de aquellas meramente simbólicas en un estudio tan amplio y una base tan grande como la que has usado en tu investigación? O sea, entiendo cómo diferenciar las leyes que tienen un efecto judicial concreto de aquellas que son, entiendo, simbólicas como para legitimarse. Eso es lo que estoy entendiendo, ¿no? Esa es una primera pregunta.
Okay.
You understand?
Yes, I understand. I'm going to speak in English because the question is very good and very complicated. So there are laws for show. I think these laws para defender la vida y la familia are for show, both conservative laws and progressive laws. So many, even gender quota laws, are for show. Like, I think when Carlos Menem and Alberto Fujimori supported gender quota laws in the 90s, it was for show, to seem progressive and gender equal and human rights promoting. And now, to show that you are the most religious, the most moral, the most supportive of the family, there are these laws for show. So I haven't tried to differentiate them in the study, but I think that one way we could do it is to look at the details and the mechanisms of implementation. Because many laws that are for show are not really serious. So the first law they passed in Argentina in 1991 for quotas was useless because it did not contain placement mandates. You could put all the women at the bottom of the list and still comply with the law. Same with the Brazilian quota law. So I'm using this as an example. So a law for show doesn't contain the detailed, they call it the reglamentación, doesn't contain all the detailed conditions and mechanisms of implementation. Now, that doesn't mean it won't be implemented, because in El Salvador, zealous prosecutors have been jailing women for the crime of homicidio who are having, miscarriages, even though it wasn't a symbolic law. So it's complicated, but I think that we can differentiate the serious ones, the symbolic ones, from the serious ones by looking at these details of implementation and implementation efforts.
Okay, thank you. Hay un comentario, ahorita no anoté, de Miriam Sacapasti Flores, que dice: cumplen la norma por miedo al castigo. Me imagino que está hablando de los hombres. No por reflexionar y reconocer su comportamiento agresivo, que está derivado en conducta violenta. No sé si quieres comentar.
Okay, yeah. Yes. But so that's possible, but the fact is there is no castigo. I mean, there are very few people who actually go to prison for these crimes. Even if there is a reporting or an investigation, the studies show that often women will desist or pull out of the process because it's so long and painful and challenging to actually reach the stage where there's a punishment of an abuser. So I think that, empirically, we don't see much punishment, But I also think that when people comply with norms, so this is ideally everybody wants an aggressor to think this is wrong, I'm not going to do it. I want to treat people as equals, I'm not going to abuse anyone. But that's very hard to achieve. And so at the very least, if there's a norm that says, oh, if my neighbors overhear me hitting my partner, they're not going to go out and gamble and drink with me, so I'll be excluded. That's an intermediate stage. So complying with the norm to change behavior. And then the theory of cognitive dissonance predicts that if your behavior changes over time, your attitudes will align. So I think that people should lower their expectations and maybe not be so demanding of the motivation for behavior change, and that just behavior change for whatever reason is good for now.
Ok, tenemos varias preguntas, no tanto tiempo, pero intentaré, a ver. De Pato Gómez, dice, muchas gracias, creo que está en Buenos Aires. Mi pregunta se refiere a las restricciones no formales que presentan las legislaciones que tienen a las mujeres como protagonistas y cómo las tienen en cuenta para los modelos presentados. Por ejemplo, estoy pensando en el incumplimiento de la debida diligencia por parte de los estados en los tratamientos judiciales de violencia de género o los mecanismos ocultos para excluir a las mujeres de los porcentajes correctos de las herencias de las familias con muchos recursos. Y como entiendo qué pasa cuando hay mecanismos informales para dar vuelta a la ley, ¿no? Para cómo se considera eso. No sé si...
Yeah.
Si se entendió.
So I think that, yes, for now, we're looking at the formal law, but so this is why the social mobilization around the law is very important, because it can bring knowledge of these workarounds to legislators and judges so that they can refine the law to deal with these. So for example, somehow this is coming to my mind in comparative political economy and studies of inequality in the US. There's this phenomenon of drift, which is that the hedge fund managers get to consider the fees they charge and all the wealth they accumulate as capital gains and not as income. And now slowly people are becoming aware of this, and there's pressure to amend the tax code so that people making hundreds of millions of dollars will actually pay the tax that they owe. And so it's a similar kind of workaround to the letter of the law. And journalists, this is why this coalition between the media, the movements, and the legislators is very important, because the legislators don't know that the wraparound is necessarily happening and how pervasive it is. Like we have this example, well, anyway, we have all of this exposure of Facebook now by the Wall Street Journal that is bringing to light all the horrible things that Facebook has done. And so the media is very important to raise awareness. That's my answer.
Okay, great. Hago las últimas dos, igual quizás en parte las has contestado, pero de Hugo Abraham Vadillo, dice, ¿las leyes deberían ser dictadas por juristas a través de la opinión pública o solo deberían ser hechos por la gente común sin necesidad de tanta formalidad jurídica? Okay. Y de Ana Lilia, quizás las contestadas tampoco, dice, ¿cómo puede contrarrestarse la mala interpretación y tergiversación de las leyes? Lo que hace que cuando se aterrizan o se implementan no se cumplan a cabalidad. Creo que un poquito lo has contestado esto último, pero si quieres ampliar algo.
What is tergiversación?
Que no se cumplen como debe ser, o sea, en el papel son una cosa, pero en la realidad
but that's
son
pervasive.
otra, ¿no?
Yeah. So let me just, so I was in a project with Victoria Murillo, Steve Levitsky, and Dan Brinks on the politics of institutional weakness in Latin America. And that's what the whole project was about how can we think about and then typologize weak and unstable institutions. And there were some so they have a typology of different forms of institutional weakness. And I highly recommend people look at this volume because it's very interesting. But one main finding is that it's not just low state capacity that explains the weakness, that sometimes state actors deliberately do not enforce and deliberately choose institutional weakness, both for societally beneficial as well as bad reasons. But there's a study of all of the micropolitics surrounding non-enforcement. And so sometimes it is weakness, sometimes it is low capacity, sometimes it is a strong social norm, like the norm that women should obey husbands, that's counteracting the progressive spirit of the law. But sometimes it's strategic. People choose not to. They choose, a governor chooses to let his friend who's a rapist off until a movement forms that embarrasses him and holds him accountable and makes it too costly, changes his analysis of the costs and benefits of impunity to the costs and benefits of following the law. And so there's a lot of room for agency, and this will be my final point, in changing the cost-benefit analysis of state actors who can enforce the law. And social movements have power to make impunity costly and to make it pay off to enforce the letter of the law. Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias, Mala. Creo
Muchísimas
que nos
gracias
has dado
a todas ustedes.
una otra perspectiva para ir más allá de pensar, la ley no sirve para nada o la ley sirve para todo, ¿no? Hay todo, no es blanco o negro, ¿no? Hay todo un proceso, hay todo un campo en el medio de acción y de costos y de repercusiones, inclusive, bueno,
muy bien
culturales,
dicho,
¿no? Que importan y nos has dado un enorme e interesante panorama en un tema clave en México. Entonces, mil gracias.
Mil gracias.
Esta es tu casa, esperamos tener, seguir vinculadas contigo y un abrazo enorme y muchísimas gracias por toda tu disposición y tu contribución. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ustedes.
Estamos en contacto, vamos a pasar ahora a la mesa siguiente, espérennos unos minutitos para organizarnos, es sobre políticas de cuidado. Mala, estás invitadísima a quedarte todo el evento. Esta es una política que muy especialmente se estará impulsando y se está impulsando en este momento en México. Entonces, todas invitados, gracias a los 194 participantes que están en el público y que nos han acompañado en estos días. Pasamos en un minuto más a la mesa de políticas de cuidado. Muchas gracias, Mala.